I'm excited for this one. The best futures bets in March Madness. We talk about who's going to win round one. We talk about who's going to go on a run, who's going to win it all. All those things are great, but let's try to make a little bit of money out of it. Now, nothing's a guarantee, obviously, but Tanner and I have lined up some picks that we feel pretty good about. And I'm going to start it off with one that I think is a savvy way to approach this. Is Duke going to win a national championship? They're the favorite. They might. What about Arizona? What about Michigan? What good teams, right? If you look at the way that the bracket sets up, taking one of these teams just to make the Final Four could be the best way to go about this. And for me, that team, I think it boils down to Duke and Michigan, the championship favorites. But I would roll with Michigan because I look at their region. They've got UMBC Howard in the first round. They've got Georgia St. Louis in the next one. They're going to get Texas Tech, Akron, Alabama, or Hofstra in the Elite Eight. In Sweet 16, excuse me, which they can win. And then coming from the other side of the bracket, most likely is going to be Iowa State. Now, that wouldn't be a walk in the park, far from it, but Michigan's only lost 3 times this entire season. One of those losses was in the conference tournament championship game. So if you talk about the 1 seed you feel probably most confident in to make the Final Four, it is probably Michigan. Minus 130 odds, which obviously we're not shooting for like plus 20,000 here or anything like that. But you're never going to get Michigan at minus 130 odds in a game until the national championship game. And if you ask me, do I trust them to beat these 16 seeds, these 8 seeds, these 5 seeds, or do I trust them more in a best of 1 against Duke? I would rather take that first approach.
I agree with that. I think Michigan's going to ultimately get to the Final Four. I think they do get to the national championship game because I think they're better than Arizona. If we do get that matchup there. And again, on the other side of the bracket, if you get a Florida, I think Michigan's live dog. If you get a Duke, Michigan would be favored against Florida, but I think Michigan would beat Florida. If you get Duke, I think that would be a unbelievable championship rematch from earlier in the season. I do think Michigan would win that game. So there's a nice setup for Michigan to get to and win the national championship. I agree with you on those, Grant. The one that I'm taking here, I'm going to kind of go against the grain. I think if there's a 2 seed that is most likely to get to the Final Four because of the setup, UConn got a great draw and they're 5-1. We talk about value. Duke being minus 135 to get to the Final Four, UConn being plus 500 to win the East region and get to the Final Four is kind of crazy to me when you're talking about just overall value. So UConn's going to start it off against Furman. They're going to beat Furman. You're going to play UCLA. I think that's going to be a tight game. I think it's one that UConn pulls out. Then you're going to have to play Michigan State. Michigan State's been up and down this season, but, Izzo has not done a whole lot in this tournament in the past 10 years. They've been to the Final Four once in the past decade. So I think UConn would win there as well. And again, Hurley was talking about the physicality of the Big East. Like, UConn's a good basketball team. We can't forget that. St. John's bodied them, but how does college sports set up? It always sets up for a team that gets embarrassed to come back and win the next game. That's exactly what happened to St. John's against UConn. That's exactly what happened with Purdue against Michigan. Doesn't mean those teams are bad. And then if we get to the final or the Elite Eight here, it would be against Duke, St. John's, or Kansas most likely. I think UConn could compete with Duke. I'm not saying they would beat them, but the depth of the ACC, like I was saying, is not massive. Depth of the Big East is not massive. And then I think if they got St. John's, they would beat St. John's because St. John's would not be playing a home game in the Big East tournament. And then Kansas, up and down, you don't know what you're going to get there. I imagine they'd be playing pretty well if they got to the Elite Eight. But I think UConn sets up pretty well with their draw, despite this being a very difficult region.
Another pick that I like that, again, not like we're taking the value through the roof or anything like that. Houston to make the Elite Eight for minus 110 odds. I would actually be interested to see how these odds would play out if you just took their money line and kind of rolled it over game after game. Because you look at their matchups, they're obviously going to beat Idaho. I would take them to beat St. Mary's, and then I would take them to beat the winner of UNC, VCU, Illinois, or Penn, probably Illinois. I would take them to win all of those games. And there might be a chance that if you just rolled the money over game after game, then that would be better odds than minus 110. But just to simplify it and just to give a perspective of what I'm looking at, they're going to beat Idaho. There's no question about that. St. Mary's could present some challenges just because they play so slow, and this Houston team is not the slow defensive team of years past. They've sacrificed some of that for offense, but I still think that they would win that game, and I think they could do it relatively comfortably. It's probably like a 7-point spread game. And then Illinois, they didn't play at all this season, but I think Houston is the better team. and that puts them in the Elite Eight. That's without having to play any like the real powerhouses of the tournament, and you're basically getting it for 1-to-1 odds. I think that's something that I would be interested in.
I agree with that as well. Team to miss the Final Four. I'm gonna go out on a limb here, and this might be a parlay pick. You might have to parlay a couple things together. But Florida to miss the Final Four minus 215 right now. You could find something else to parlay that with. You could parlay that with the game pick. But I think there's some value in that when you look at Florida's draw here. You're going to play against Iowa. I think Florida ultimately wins that game. Nebraska could give Florida some trouble. Like, we don't know how good Florida is. Every game came down to the wire last year. Obviously, they're not as good this year as they were last year. From a complete standpoint, it's also really hard to go back to back. And then I think if you got Houston versus Florida, or Illinois for that matter, I don't see Florida winning against Houston based on what happened last year in the national championship game. There would be no team more motivated to beat the Florida Gators than that Houston team. We saw how they physically imposed their will on Kansas in the Big 12 semifinal. Obviously, the Big 12 championship didn't go their way, but Houston's still a really good team. I think that would be one to note for minus 215. Pretty good value there when you could parlay that with something else in that minus 200 range to get yourself some plus money value.
It's interesting. It's minus 215. So the odds makers are pretty confident Florida's not making the Final Four.
Well, they're not a fake 1 seed, but they're definitely the weakest 1 seed. And that goes, again, if UConn wins the Big East championship, they're moving up a line. If Michigan, there was one other that would have knocked Florida out. Who's the twos here? Iowa State, Purdue is a 2, Houston's a 2. If Houston won the Big 12, they're moving up a line, I would think, right? So they're kind of like the fakest 1 seed, I would say.
Yeah, they're definitely the weakest of them all. I'm just looking at the bracket. I was looking at some odds earlier at Kalshi, and I want to say there was something like a 77% chance that at least 3 1 seeds made the Final Four, but then I forget the odds of all 4 of them making it. I want to say it was pretty low, like in the 20s or 30s, something like that. So the expectation does seem to be there will be only 3. And I'm with you. Florida is the worst of them. Do they have the most difficult region? It's not the toughest. It's not the easiest. If we're talking about 2 seed matchups, if you're a 1 seed, would you rather play UConn, Purdue coming off of what they did, or Houston? What's the easiest matchup of those 3?
UConn, Purdue, probably Purdue, I would say.
I would say so as well, despite them beating Michigan.
You could make the case that it's UConn, but Duke and UConn match up really well against each other. And UConn, we saw it with UConn and Florida last year. They should have beat Florida in the NCAA tournament last year. So you can really make the case that UConn could beat anybody. I would say Purdue probably, because again, there was motivation to come in and smack. Michigan smacked Purdue in Purdue in Indiana. So there's motivation to come back and win that next game.
Yeah, I'm with you. I didn't have Florida in my Final Four in my bracket either, but I didn't realize that it was be minus 210, minus 215, whatever you said.
So who is your Final Four, Grant? I think that's unless you have any more futures here for us, who is your Final Four? I think that'd be a good way to conclude the segment here.
Well, I'll be very honest and say my bracket is pretty boring, which I didn't enjoy. I enjoy it when I was filling it out, but again, we saw it last year in NIL. Rather than players going to get opportunities to start elsewhere, they're just making their money and sitting on the bench behind these other guys at the top level programs. So my Final Four is Duke. It's Michigan. No surprise. I did have Houston as a 2 coming out of the Florida region, which is the South. And then I think whoever wins Arizona, Arkansas is going to the Final Four in the West. And I was different, and I took Arkansas.
I like that. I worry about Arkansas's depth. I think it's going to be Duke going to the Final Four. I think Arizona goes to the Final Four because, like you said, if you can get through that game, you're in a really good spot. I would say Michigan is going to the Final Four, and then I also have Houston. So I have pretty much the same thing outside the Arkansas pick, but 3 1 seeds and a 2 seed going to the Final Four.
If I told you Arkansas beat Arizona, would you put them in the Final Four?
It depends on. So my fear with Purdue, if they play up to the standard that they did against Michigan, I think physicality-wise, they can wear down Arkansas.
Okay.
That would be my biggest fear.
Just wondering if we literally had the same bracket, just with Arizona and Arkansas flipped.
Well, we didn't have all the early games the same, I guess, but
Oh, I just meant of the Final Four.
Who were your? What did you have? UConn, Duke.
UConn, Duke. Again, Arizona, Arkansas winner. I had Arkansas. I had
against Purdue.
Yes, against Purdue. I had Michigan, Iowa State, and Houston, Florida.
Yeah, I had all those.
So pretty much all 1s and 2s, basically.
1s and 2s, yeah. So, again, chalk is safe. That's all I'll say, people. Why are we picking trendy upsets? They don't happen as much. Go with favorites. Favorites win, especially in today's world. We saw it last year. I hate when people are like, oh, you just picked all the favorites. So the favorites win. It was the favorites. They're favored for a reason.
Exactly. That's one of the billion-dollar industries. That's who they think is going to win the game. So they're probably right.
Probably right. But anyways, guys, that was Ride the Line, the greatest podcast in sports betting entertainment. Tournament time's here. We're going to be back all weekend talking about picks. We'll be back on Friday, giving our reactions to the Thursday game, looking ahead to the weekend and all that. So we appreciate you guys joining us. Make sure you smash that subscribe button. And Grant, take us out of here.
That's going to do it for this episode of Ride the Line. We appreciate you all. Enjoy the games. We will catch you on the next episode of Ride the Line.